The War of Attrition involved fighting between Israel and Egypt, Jordan, PLO and their allies from 1967 to 1970. Following the 1967 Six-Day War, no serious diplomatic efforts tried to resolve the issues at the heart of the Arab-Israeli conflict. In September 1967, the Arab states formulated the three no's policy, barring peace, recognition or negotiations with Israel. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser believed that only military initiative would compel Israel or the international community to facilitate a full Israeli withdrawal from Sinai, and hostilities soon resumed along the Suez Canal. These initially took the form of limited artillery duels and small-scale incursions into Sinai, but by 1969 the Egyptian army judged itself prepared for larger-scale operations. On March 8, 1969, Nasser proclaimed the official launch of the War of Attrition, characterized by large-scale shelling along the Suez Canal, extensive aerial warfare and commando raids. Hostilities continued until August 1970 and ended with a ceasefire, the frontiers remaining the same as when the war began, with no real commitment to serious peace negotiations. Egyptian front. Egypt was determined to regain Sinai, and also sought to mitigate the severity of its defeat. Sporadic clashes were taking place along the ceasefire line, and Egyptian missile boats sank the Israeli destroyer in Eilat on October 21 of the same year. Egypt began shelling Israeli positions along the Bar-Lev line, using heavy artillery, MiG aircraft and various other forms of Soviet assistance with the hope of forcing the Israeli government into concessions. Israel responded with aerial bombardments, airborne raids on Egyptian military positions, and aerial strikes against strategic facilities in Egypt. The international community in both countries attempted to find a diplomatic solution to the conflict. The jarring mission of the United Nations was supposed to ensure that the terms of UN Security Council Resolution 242 would be observed. But by late 1970 it was clear that this mission had been a failure. Fearing the escalation of the conflict into an East versus West confrontation during the tensions of the mid-Cold War, the American President, Richard Nixon, sent his Secretary of State, William Rogers, to formulate the Rogers Plan in view of obtaining a ceasefire. In August 1970, Israel, Jordan, and Egypt agreed to an in-place ceasefire under the terms proposed by the Rogers Plan. The plan contained restrictions on missile deployment by both sides, and required the cessation of raids as a precondition for peace. The Egyptians and their Soviet allies rekindled the conflict by violating the agreement shortly thereafter, moving their missiles near to the Suez Canal, and constructing the largest anti-aircraft system yet implemented at that point in history. The Israelis responded with a policy which their Prime Minister, Golda Meir, dubbed asymmetrical response, wherein Israeli retaliation was disproportionately large in comparison to any Egyptian attacks. Following Nasser's death in September 1970, his successor, Anwar al-Sadat, continued the ceasefire with Israel, focusing on rebuilding the Egyptian army and planning a full-scale attack on the Israeli forces controlling the eastern bank of the Suez Canal. These plans would materialize 3 years later in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Ultimately, Israel would return Sinai to Egypt after the two nations signed a peace treaty. Various military historians have commented on the war with differing opinions. Chaim Herzog notes that Israel withstood the battle and adapted itself to a hitherto alien type of warfare. Zeev Schaff notes that though Israel suffered losses, she was still able to preserve her military accomplishments of 1967 and that despite increased Soviet involvement, Israel had stood firm. Simon Dunstan notes that, although Israel continued to hold the Bar-Lev line, the war's conclusion led to a dangerous complacency within the Israeli High Command about the resolve of the Egyptian armed forces and the strength of the Bar-Lev line on the tactical level. Kenneth Pollock notes that Egypt's commandos performed adequately, though they rarely ventured into risky operations on a par with the daring of Israel's commandos. Egypt's artillery corps encountered difficulty in penetrating the Bar-Lev forts and eventually adopted a policy of trying to catch Israeli troops in the exterior parts of the forts. The Egyptian Air Force and Air Defense Forces performed poorly. Egyptian pilots were rigid, slow to react and unwilling to improvise. According to U.S. intelligence estimates, Egypt lost 109 aircraft, most in air-to-air combat, while only 16 Israeli aircraft were lost, most to anti-aircraft artillery or SAMs. It took a salvo of 6 to 10 SAR-2 Egyptian anti-aircraft missiles to obtain a better than 50% chance of a hit. Timeline: 1967 July 1, 1967. An Egyptian commando force from Port Food moves south and takes up a position at Ras el-Ish, located 10 miles south of Port Said on the eastern bank of the Suez Canal, an area controlled by the Israelis since the ceasefire on June 9, 1967. An Israeli armored infantry company attacks the Egyptian force. The Israeli company drives off the Egyptians but loses 1 dead and 13 wounded. However, another source claims that an Israeli attack on Port Food was repulsed. July 2, 1967. The Israeli Air Force bombs Egyptian artillery positions that had supported the commandos at Ras al-Ish. July 4, 1967. Egyptian Air Force jets strike several Israeli targets in Sinai. An Egyptian MiG-17 is shot down. July 8, 1967. An Egyptian Air Force MiG-21 is shot down by Israeli air defenses while on a reconnaissance mission over El Kanatra. 2 Su-7s equipped with cameras are then sent out to carry out the mission, and manage to complete several turns over Sinai without any opposition. 2 other Su-7s are sent for another reconnaissance mission hours later, but are attacked by Israeli Air Force fighter jets. 1 Su-7 is shot down. July 11-12, 1967. Battle of Rumani Coast. The Israeli Navy destroyer in Eilat and 2 torpedo boats sink 2 Egyptian torpedo boats off the Rumani coast. No crewmen on the Egyptian torpedo boats are known to have survived, and there were no Israeli casualties. July 14, 1967. Artillery exchanges and aerial duels erupt near the Suez Canal. 7 Egyptian fighter aircraft are shot down. July 15, 1967. An Israeli Air Force Mirage 3 is shot down by an Egyptian MiG-21. October 21, 1967. The Egyptian Navy sinks the Israeli destroyer in Eilat with anti-ship missiles, killing 47 sailors. October 1967. In retaliation to the sinking of the Eilat, Israeli artillery bombards oil refineries and depots near Suez. In a series of artillery exchanges throughout October, the Egyptians sustained civilian casualties. Egypt evacuates a large number of the civilian population in the Canal region. 1968 March 21, 1968. In response to persistent PLO raids against Israeli civilian targets, Israel attacks the town of Karameh, Jordan, the site of a major PLO camp, but is met with resistance by Jordanian and PLO forces. They then fight their way back to Israeli territory, taking with them as much military equipment as they can, along with 120 to 150 prisoners. Both sides suffered significant casualties and material losses, but Jordanian and PLO losses were far greater than Israel's. June 1968. The war officially begins with sparse Egyptian artillery bombardment of the Israeli front line on the east bank of the Suez Canal. More artillery bombardments in the following months cause Israeli casualties. September 8, 1968. An Egyptian artillery barrage kills 10 Israeli soldiers and injures 18. Israel responds by shelling Suez and Ismailia. October 30, 1968. Israeli helicopter-borne Seret Matkal commandos carry out Operation Helam, destroying an Egyptian electric transformer station, 2 dams along the Nile River and a bridge. The blackout causes Nasser to cease hostilities for a few months while fortifications around hundreds of important targets are built. Simultaneously, Israel reinforces its position on the east bank of the Suez Canal by construction of the Bar-Lev Line. November 3, 1968. Egyptian MiG-17s attack Israeli positions, and are met by Israeli interceptors. 1 Israeli plane is damaged. December 1, 1968. Israeli helicopter-borne commandos destroy 4 bridges near Amman, Jordan. December 3, 1968. The Israeli Air Force bombs PLO camps in Jordan. The Israeli jets are intercepted by Hawker hunters of the Royal Jordanian Air Force, and an Israeli fighter jet is damaged during the brief air battle. 1969. March 8, 1969. Egypt strikes the Bar-Lev Line with artillery fire and airstrikes, causing heavy casualties. Israel retaliates with raids deep into Egyptian territory, causing severe damage. March 9, 1969. The Egyptian Chief of Staff, General Abdul Munim Riyad, is killed in an Israeli mortar attack while visiting the front lines along the Suez Canal. May, July 1969. Heavy fighting takes place between Israeli and Egyptian forces. Israel loses 47 dead and 157 wounded, while Egyptian casualties are far heavier. July 18, 1969. Egyptian commandos raid Israeli military installations in Sinai. July 1920, 1969. 6 Israeli soldiers and 80 Egyptian soldiers are killed. Some Egyptian casualties are caused by their own artillery. July 20 to 28, 1969. Operation Boxer. Nearly the entire Israeli Air Force attacks the northern sector of the canal, destroying anti-aircraft positions, tanks and artillery, and shooting down 8 Egyptian aircraft. An estimated 300 Egyptian soldiers are killed, and Egyptian positions are seriously mauled. Israeli losses amount to 2 aircraft. Egyptian artillery fire is reduced somewhat. However, shelling with lighter weapons, particularly mortars, continues. August 1969. The Israeli Air Force flies about 1,000 combat sorties against Egypt, destroying dozens of SAM sites and shooting down 21 aircraft. 3 Israeli aircraft are lost. September 9, 1969. Operation Raviv. Israeli forces raid Egypt's Red Sea coast. The raid is preceded by Operation Escort, with Shatet 13 naval commandos sinking a pair of Egyptian torpedo boats that could have threatened the Israeli raiding party. 3 commandos are killed when an explosive device detonates prematurely. Israeli troops backed up by aircraft captured Egyptian armor, and destroy 12 Egyptian outposts. The Egyptians suffer 100 to 200 casualties, and a Soviet general serving as a consultant to the Egyptians is also killed, while 1 Israeli soldier is lightly injured. An Israeli plane is shot down during the raid, and the pilot's fate is still unknown. September 11, 1969. 16 Egyptian aircraft carry out a strike mission. 8 MiGs are shot down by Israeli Mirages and a further 3 Su-7s are lost to Israeli anti-aircraft artillery and Hawk surface-to-air missiles. October 17, 1969. The United States and Soviet Union began diplomatic talks to end the conflict. December 9, 1969. Egyptian aircraft, with the assistance of newly delivered P-15 radars, defeats the Israelis in an aerial engagement, shooting down 2 Israeli Mirages. Later in the evening, an Egyptian fighter flown by LT Ahmed ATEF shot down an Israeli F-4 Phantom II, making him the first Egyptian pilot to shoot down an F-4 in combat. The same day, the Rogers Plan is publicized. It calls for Egyptian commitment to peace, in exchange for the Israeli withdrawal from Sinai. Both parties strongly reject the plan. Nasser forestalled any movement toward direct negotiations with Israel. In dozens of speeches and statements, Nasser posited the equation that any direct peace talks with Israel were tantamount to surrender. President Nasser instead opts to plead for more sophisticated weaponry from the Soviet Union to withstand the Israeli bombings. The Soviets initially refused to deliver the requested weapons. December 26–27, 1969, Israel launches Operation Rooster 53, carried out by paratroopers transported by Sikorsky CH-53E and Super Frelon helicopters. The operation results in the capture of an Egyptian P-12 radar at Ras Gharib and carrying it to Israel by two CH-53C Stallion helicopters. The operation enabled Israeli and American learning of the latest Soviet radar technology, and caused a huge morale impact on the Egyptians. 1970 January 22, 1970. President Nasser secretly flies to Moscow to discuss the situation. His request for new SAM batteries is approved. Their deployment requires qualified personnel along with squadrons of aircraft to protect them. Thus, he needed Red Army personnel in large numbers, something the Kremlin did not want to provide. Nasser then threatens to resign, implying that Egypt might turn to the United States for help in the future. The Soviets had invested heavily in President Nasser's regime, and so, the Soviet leader, General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev, finally obliged. The Soviet presence was to increase from 2,500–4,000 in January to 10,600–12,150 by June 30. January 22, 1970. Operation Rhodes. Israeli paratroopers and naval commandos are transported by IAF Super Frelon helicopters to Shadwin Island, where they kill 70 Egyptian soldiers and take 62 more prisoner at the loss of 3 dead and 7 wounded. The soldiers dismantle an Egyptian radar and other military equipment for transport back to Israel. IAF aircraft sink 2 Egyptian P-183 torpedo boats during the operation. February 1970. An Egyptian commando platoon attempts to set up an ambush in the vicinity of the Mitla Pass but is discovered. The entire unit is either killed or captured. February 5, 1970. Israeli auxiliary ships are damaged in the port of Eilat during a raid by Egyptian frogmen. February 9, 1970. An air battle between Israeli and Egyptian warplanes takes place, with each side losing 1 plane. March 15, 1970. The first fully operational Soviet SAM site in Egypt is completed. It is part of 3 brigades which the Soviet Union sends to Egypt. Israeli F-4 Phantom II jets repeatedly bomb Egyptian positions in Sinai. April 8, 1970. The Israeli Air Force carries out bombing raids against targets identified as Egyptian military installations. A group of military bases about 30 kilometers from the Suez Canal is bombed. However, in what becomes known as the Bar el-Bakr incident, Israeli F-4 Phantom II fighter jets attack a single-floor school in the Egyptian town of Bar el-Bakr, after it was mistaken for a military installation. The school is hit by 5 bombs and 2 air-to-ground missiles, killing 46 schoolchildren and injuring over 50. This incident put a definite end to the campaign, and the Israelis instead then concentrate upon canal-side installations. The respite gives the Egyptians time to reconstruct its SAM batteries closer to the canal. Soviet-flown MiG fighters provide the necessary air cover. Soviet pilots also begin approaching IAF aircraft during April 1970, but Israeli pilots have orders not to engage these aircraft and break off whenever Soviet-piloted MiGs appear. April 1970. The Kuwaiti armed forces suffered their first Kuwaiti fatality on the Egyptian front. May 1970. During the final days of the month, the IAF launched major air raids against Port Said, believing a large amphibious force is assembling in the town. On the 16th, an Israeli aircraft is shot down in air combat, probably by a MiG-21. May 3, 1970. 21 Palestinian guerrillas are killed by Israeli troops in the Jordan Valley. June 1970. An Israeli armored raid on Syrian military positions results in hundreds of Syrian casualties. June 25, 1970. An Israeli A-4 Skyhawk, in an attack sortie against Egyptian forces on the canal, is attacked and pursued by a pair of Soviet MiG-21s into Sinai. According to the Soviets, the plane was shot down, while the Israelis claim that it was damaged and forced to land at a nearby airbase. June 27, 1970. The EAF continued to launch air raids across the canal. On June 27, around 8 Egyptian Su-7s and MiG-21s attack Israeli rear areas in Sinai. According to Israel, 2 Egyptian aircraft were shot down. An Israeli Mirage was shot down, and the pilot was captured. June 1970. The Kuwaiti armed forces suffer 16 Kuwaiti fatalities on the Egyptian front. July 18, 1970. An Israeli airstrike on Egypt causes casualties among Soviet military personnel. June 30, 1970. Soviet air defenses shoot down 2 Israeli F-4 Phantoms. 2 pilots and a navigator are captured, while a second navigator is rescued by helicopter the following night. July 30, 1970. A large-scale dogfight occurs between Israeli and Soviet aircraft codenamed Rimmon-20, involving 12 to 24 Soviet MiG-21s, and 12 Israeli Dassault Mirage IIIs and 4 F-4 Phantom II jets. The engagement takes place west of the Suez Canal. After luring their opponents into an ambush, the Israelis shoot down 4 of the Soviet-piloted MiGs. A 5th is possibly hit and later crashes en route back to base. 4 Soviet pilots are killed, while the IAF suffers no losses except a damaged Mirage. The Soviets respond by luring Israeli fighter jets into a counter-ambush, downing 2, and deploying more aircraft to Egypt. Following the Soviets' direct intervention, known as Operation Kavkaz, Washington fears an escalation and redoubles efforts toward a peaceful resolution to the conflict. Early August 1970. Despite their losses, the Soviets and Egyptians managed to press the air defenses closer to the canal, shooting down a number of Israeli aircraft. The SAM batteries allow the Egyptians to move in artillery, which in turn threatens the Bar-Lev line. August 7, 1970. A ceasefire agreement is reached, forbidding either side from changing the military status quo within zones extending 50 kilometers to the east and west of the ceasefire line. Minutes after the ceasefire, Egypt begins moving SAM batteries into the zone even though the agreement explicitly forbids new military installations. By October there are approximately 100 SAM sites in the zone. September 28, 1970. President Nasser dies of a heart attack, and is succeeded by Vice President Anwar Sadat.